Let's talk first about what opera is, because before we can get into conducting opera, we've got to understand what this particular genre is. And what it is actually a combination and a synergy of various discrete art forms, and that's what makes it really special. So you have elements of the theater, you have elements of dance, you have lyric elements, and you also have symphonic elements. And each of these art forms can stand on their own, but when you combine them all together on one stage for one production, that is the magic of opera. Now, why is this important for us to understand? Because in order to fully be able to give a great performance in opera conducting, you have to be familiar and understand each of these art forms, these separate art forms. So, for example, in the theater, we have to have a sense of dramatic pacing, timing, using the word for dramatic emphasis, and some kind of chiaroscuro with time. Some people speak quickly, some other characters speak slowly. Why and how do we pace that? With dance, we need to understand the dancers and what kind of movements they have, what kind of timing they need. We need to be able to respond to them. In the lyric department, we have to understand the voice. We need to understand the breath and also the beauty and the natural music of the words themselves. And if we've never worked with voice, then we don't know this yet. And the same is true of the symphonic world, working with an orchestra. If we've only been a coach or a répétiteur and we've not had access to an orchestra and we haven't studied all the different instruments and how they work together and what their characteristics are, we will not be able to fully understand the world of opera. So this is why it's important to be familiar with these principal 4 art forms that come together to make the beauty of opera. Now let's talk about what makes opera different and unique. We have some primary aspects that we want to talk about, which is what I call the 3 T's. And the 3 T's are traits, talents, and terrain. So let's talk about the first one, traits. You have the nature or the genre of opera, which we talked about previously, the fact that it is a synthesis of various discrete art forms. That's something very special only to opera. We have another thing, which is the materia prima, right? Contrary to other forms where you just basically have the score in front of you, in opera conducting, you have the libretto, you have the vocal score, and you have the full score to contend with. So you have 3 raw materials that you're working with and you're referring to constantly throughout an opera production. So these are things to consider under traits of opera. The second is talents, and this is basically people in the opera world and what they do together. So first of all, we have a lot more people in an opera production. We have people on stage, all kinds of people, from the soloist to the chorus to the stand-ins and the figurants, and then we also have the ballet. We have people in the pit, which are the orchestral musicians. We have people backstage, all the lighting designs, all the scenographers, and then we have the choreographer, we have the artistic director, we have people, technicians in the booth behind with the subtitles, and so much more. So this is a very rich world, and it's a very heterogeneous world. And this is what we love about opera, but you have to be aware that this world is very big and rich. You also have relationships to understand, because the pyramidal structure is not the same in opera as it is in other forms of conducting. You have to be able to really have a collaboration with other directors, such as the stage director, also the lighting designer, and the choreographer, and so on. So it's a team effort, which is very interesting and very inspiring, but we have to be respectful of that and understand that that's the process that goes on with opera. And speaking of process, there's also something that's very interesting about the role of the conductor itself during an opera production, which is that it is evolutionary. In the beginning, the stage director, if we're talking about a new production, the stage director is going to run most of the rehearsals because they need to do their work and set the stage literally for their production. And we are there to help and to do the musical aspect, but we do not run the rehearsal. But little by little, as the rehearsal process continues and we get closer and closer to the stage time and the show time, then the music kind of takes over a little bit and we get to see the orchestra, work with the singers, do musical run-throughs, and then by the time the opening night comes, we run the show as conductors. So that's also a very interesting evolutionary process that is fascinating about the role of a conductor in opera conducting in particular. Now let's talk about terrain. There's a specific environment to opera conducting which other forms of conducting don't have and we don't consider in the same way. One is space. So most of the time we're on the same platform with our musicians in conducting, but not so in opera conducting. We are in the kind of entresol, or between two principal platforms, right? The one on stage and then the other one in the pit, and we're in the middle. And that is a wonderful place for us to be, obviously, because we can see and control both. But it also means that we must be in constant contact with both the stage and the pit. So this is something that we have to negotiate. There's also the possibility that you could have singers or dancers or actors behind you in the public. So you could really have a 360-degree experience while conducting an opera, both from a horizontal standpoint and also from a vertical standpoint. So it's really quite complete. Then there's another element, which is time. In most traditional symphonic rehearsals, you know exactly what your rehearsals are. You're going to run them and you know, I want to spend 15 minutes on this, 20 minutes on that, and you can handle what time you're given in these rehearsal periods. In the opera world, it can either be extremely condensed or very expanded. So if you have a jump-in, for example, you will either have no rehearsal or you'll have one rehearsal for the entire opera and it might not even be enough time during your one rehearsal to go through the entire opera. So in that case, the time is very condensed. In the other hand, you could have a new production, in which case you're there for weeks on end and you have to be very attentive, but your work will not be the same. And it will evolve as the new production evolves and gets ready to have the opening night. So in that case, time is very expanded, and this is something we have to get used to also. So these are various elements of the terrain which makes opera and opera conducting unique.